Very quickly, we're going to do a couple of examples of gradient function. So if we have a sketch of a curve of a function, we can sketch the gradient function based on the gradient in different sections of the curve. So if we have a look at this first one, if we call this f of x, I'll use it in a light colored. Now, it's important to see, we look at this curve and we think, well, the sections of the curve, we don't know exactly what the gradient is, but the sections of the curve which have positive gradient, sections which have negative, and if one's negative and one's positive, well, at some point it has to cross over from negative to positive, so there must be zero. Now, this is positive, right? We're going uphill, uphill. This is all positive section. Now, this is less steep. It's still a positive gradient. Now, what happens at this point, if I think about it, as at that exact point, I would be horizontal. It's a horizontal line, or the tangent at that point is horizontal. And so the gradient is zero. Now, on the left-hand side of that, the gradient is now sloping down. So it's negative, negative, negative all the way along. There's no other turning points. And we talked about how where the gradient is zero, we might call that it's stationary. It's not moving. We could call it a stationary point. Okay, now the thing is, if I now want to sketch a curve based on the gradient as my output, so the x values are going to be the same, whereas the y values of my new curve, which I'm going to do in pink, the y values are going to be the gradient of the curve at each point. So where it's zero, that's where the y value is zero. So that's going to be this point here. It's going to be touching the x-axis at that point. So that's important to realize. Now, to the right of this point, it's all positive. So the line is going to be above the x-axis. And actually, it's just sort of, the curve is gradually getting steeper. It's a parabola, so it's gradually getting steeper and steeper. So the gradient is increasing steadily. So we would show that, okay, the gradient is getting larger and larger and larger and larger and larger. It would just go on. As this curve continued, the gradient would continue to increase. Now, if we look to the left-hand side in this section, next to where it's zero, it's negative, but it's very small. It's not very steep at all. So it's just negative. So it's below the x-axis. But as we go further and further left, it gets steeper and steeper and steeper, but it's sort of larger in the negative direction. So that means it's going to be going down like that, and we put an arrow. And roughly speaking, that is the gradient function. Okay, let's try one more. We've got this curve here, so we go along and we trace it. Now the gradient here is positive, 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 positive. Now when I graph the x value with the y value of the gradient of this function, it's going to be above. We notice here it's going to be zero, the tangent is going to be horizontal. Alright, and then here this middle section is negative, 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 so that's going to be below the x-axis. And then we're going to have another turnaround, a stationary point, or it stopped. If this was a distance time graph, then it would be where we stop briefly for a rest. The gradient in this section I'm writing is positive, and then it's zero again because I can think of it as a horizontal, and then it's just negative all the way down here. I might do it in blue this time. So if I trace down this line, when the gradient is my output, so the y value of my new function is zero, which means that it is on the x-axis. Alright, so those are kind of like three key points here. I know that it has to go through these key points. So, this section here is positive. Everything to the left of my first point. So it's going to be kind of like that. Now, usually we're going to expect a smooth curve. Then it hits zero and then it goes below. But do you notice that it's kind of not very steep, and then it gets a bit, so it's not very steep here, and then it gets a bit steeper, and then it's not very steep again, and then goes to zero. So basically it's kind of getting more negative and then it gets less negative. So it's kind of more negative, and then the gradient actually starts coming back closer to 0, and now it's 0. Now the next section, it's all positive, so it's going to be above, but same thing happens. It's sort of less steep first, steep, it gets steeper, and then gets less steep, back to 0. So it's going to get steeper, more positive. I don't know exact amounts, but I just know that it's going to get back closer to 0. And then it is negative, 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 and it's getting steeper and steeper and steeper, which means it would just kind of go, whoops, it would just kind of go down that way. Down, 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 down. And so the blue line is what we have. Now, if I just kind of get rid of that black line over the top, you see how that's what it looks like? I can go back. See how that's what it looks like? Get rid of it again. So that's the blue line, and that's the comparison. You notice that it's got one less turn in it. The black line goes, ooh, the black line goes 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns, and then down. Whereas the blue line goes 1 turn, 2 turns, and then down. It's got one less turn. Interesting. And that was the same in the earlier one. Have a think about it. Exercise 8.1.